The Baltic Sea roiled with a sombre, restless tint beneath a muted winter shroud along the rugged Estonian coastline, where the islet of Saaremaa gently kissed the mainland's edge. Waves lapped persistently against the skeletal frame of a long vessel, half submerged in coarse, gritty sand, not a meticulously preserved artifact of a noble chieftain, but a battle-scarred craft, hastily cloaked with earth by trembling hands. The era hovered around 750 AD, nearly 5 decades before the world would recoil in dread at the ominous title Viking. Within this watery crypt lay the remains of 7 warriors, their skeletons cradled by the sandy terrain, whispering a chronicle more haunting than any northern ballad yet composed. One skull bore the unmistakable imprint of a blade's brutal thrust, a precise, square cavity gouged through the bone with lethal intent. Another's hands dangled precariously, nearly severed, etched with jagged defensive scars from a frantic final stand. A third had been cleanly decapitated, the neck's vertebrae revealing a swift surgical slice from a finely honed sword. Nearby, a grander ship tomb sheltered 33 additional combatants, their bones meticulously arranged in orderly rows, weapons still clutched by skeletal fingers, as if ready for one last fight. These souls did not slip away in serene repose. They met violent ends far from their ancestral shores, their comrades honouring them with solemn burial rites amid a foreign land. This is the Salme burial ground, an archaeological testament to Scandinavian warriors engaged in structured warfare, predating the infamous assault on Lindisfarne Abbey in 793 AD, long hailed as the dawn of the Viking Age by nearly half a century. These men, not yet branded with the Viking name, were their direct precursors, the vanguard of a burgeoning maritime dominion that would cast a long shadow over early medieval Europe. Who were these proto-raiders, shrouded in the mists of time? What desperate impulses propelled them to venture beyond their borders into hostile realms? How did they forge the ships, wield the arms, and devise the tactics that would render their descendants legendary across the known world? The answers lie buried deep within northern Europe's frigid soil, sunken wrecks swallowed by the sea, forgotten graves swallowed by time, charred remnants of coastal hamlets swallowed by flame, and scattered hoards of silver swallowed by those who never returned to claim them. This is the saga of the first Vikings, a narrative woven from threads of desperation and ingenuity, savage brutality and extraordinary resilience. It commences not with the dramatic Lindisfarne raid that jolted Christendom awake, but in the shadowy centuries before, when the bedrock of Viking might was hammered into shape with blood and steel along Scandinavia's jagged coastlines, the crucible of the north. The unforgiving terrain of 7th century Scandinavia, destined to crystallize into the nations of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, simmered with a volatile blend of ecological, societal, and political currents that would eventually unleash the Viking phenomenon upon the globe. Snorri Thorson stirred from a fitful sleep to the piercing wail of his youngest child, the winter having descended as the harshest in living memory, its icy grip unrelenting with the ensuing spring, offering only the faintest glimmer of reprieve. As the promise of summer loomed on the horizon, their meagre stores dwindled to dust, and hunger settled into their bones as a relentless companion within the modest confines of their longhouse near what would later be christened Uppland in Sweden. His wife Astrid shifted beside him on their rough straw pallet, her breath shallow with exhaustion. "The babe needs sustenance," she murmured, her voice a fragile thread, "as do we all." Snorri rose stiffly, his joints aching from the cold, and moved toward the heart of their dwelling, where the hearth's embers still flickered weakly in the pre-dawn gloom. Once a bustling haven for 3 generations and their thralls, the longhouse now echoed with emptiness. His parents had succumbed to the winter's ferocity. 2 of his 5 children had withered away from illness exacerbated by starvation, and even 2 of their prized cattle had been slaughtered prematurely, their meat hastily consumed while the rest spoiled, before proper curing could be managed. Through the smoke hole above, Snorri glimpsed the faint twinkle of stars, fading as dawn crept closer, casting long shadows across the frost-bitten landscape. A decision loomed large, one that had taken root in his mind during the endless, despair-filled nights of winter. The land of the north had always been a stern taskmaster. Farming was a precarious endeavour, its brief growing season and shallow, rocky soil yielding harvests too meagre to sustain growing needs. For centuries, Scandinavians had bolstered their survival with hunting, fishing, and localized barter. But a profound shift had begun to unfold. The climate had grown colder over recent decades. Harvests faltered with alarming frequency, populations swelled during years of plenty, and now the number of mouths to feed outstripped the land's capacity. Political transformations compounded these natural trials as minor kingdoms coalesced across the Scandinavian expanse, their chieftains, once able to maintain authority through lavish gift-giving and grand feasts, finding their resources stretched thin, unable to reward the young warriors who once swelled their retinues. These young men, trained from youth in the use of weapons, skilled in the ways of the sea, found themselves with diminishing prospects under the old order. As Snorri tended the dying fire, his eldest son Leif entered the main chamber, his tall frame at 16 already surpassing his father's, his broad shoulders and calloused hands bearing the marks of toil on the unforgiving earth. "You're pondering it again," Leif stated, his tone carrying the weight of understanding rather than inquiry. Snorri nodded solemnly. Bjorn Ironclad had returned from the east last autumn, his crew laden with silver, pelts, and amber, their losses confined to 2 ships claimed by storms rather than foes. The gods smiled upon them, Leif observed, a hint of envy in his voice. "The gods favour those who seize their fate," Snorri corrected, with quiet resolve. Bjorn would sail again, when the ice thawed in the eastern seas, seeking stout men to join his crew. "You'd leave us behind?" Astrid had slipped in silently, their youngest cradled against her hip, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I'd rescue us," he replied, his voice steady. "One prosperous voyage could yield wealth to carry us through harsh winters, rebuild our herd, perhaps even purchase more land, or see me buried in foreign soil," he added, acknowledging the risk. Her response lacked conviction, her silence betraying her reluctant acceptance of the inevitable logic driving their plight. Similar conversations reverberated through longhouses across Scandinavia, a chorus of desperation born from environmental strain, population pressure, and the slow unification of political power. This convergence created a class of men, adept in combat, all free and trained from boyhood, with spear and axe, yet finding their traditional roles as retainers to local lords increasingly obsolete. Seasoned sailors, their coastal navigation skills honed by necessity in a land of fjords but confined to short voyages until now. Necessity now urged them to gaze beyond their familiar horizons. To the east, across the Baltic, lay lands rich with resources. To the south and west stretched the prosperous, yet increasingly vulnerable, post-Roman settlements. The stage was set for a grand expansion. All that remained was the means to act and the moment to strike. The vessels that would redefine the course of history lay not merely in their intended use, but in the ingenuity of their construction. By the mid-8th century, Scandinavian shipwrights had begun to craft boats that stood apart from anything else in Europe, their designs laying the groundwork for the legendary longships still to come. Thorkel, a weathered artisan whose hands bore the permanent curve of decades spent wielding adze and hammer, ran his calloused fingers along the smooth curved oak rib of his latest creation. This vessel, taking shape like a vast wooden leaf on the pebbled shore, was commissioned by Bjorn Ironclad and promised to be the swiftest yet. "She'll outpace any craft we've built before," Thorkel assured, his voice rough with pride. Designed with a shallow draft to navigate the winding rivers of foreign lands, built with flexibility to ride the unpredictable swells of the open sea, and constructed with the strength to carry 40 men, along with their weapons and provisions, this ship was a marvel of its time. It stood in stark contrast to the cumbersome merchant vessels of the Frisians, or the ponderous warships of the Byzantine Empire. Long, narrow, and gracefully proportioned, its revolutionary clinker-built technique, where overlapping planks were fastened like the scales of a fish, rendered it lighter and far more adaptable than its contemporaries. "What of the keel?" Bjorn inquired, his keen eyes tracing the ship's backbone. "A single oak timber seasoned through 3 harsh winters," Thorkel replied, a glint of satisfaction in his gaze. "Hewn from the king's own forest. It cost me a silver arm ring to divert the warden's watchful eye." Bjorn nodded in approval, impressed by the craftsmanship. "And the sail?" he pressed further. "Woven by my wife and daughters throughout the long winter months," Thorkel explained, "from the finest wool, tightly spun and treated with horse fat to repel the fiercest rains. It will harness even the faintest whisper of a breeze." This versatility, propelled by sail to conserve the crew's strength, rode when winds deserted them, with a shallow draft allowing landings on any beach or riverbank. Forged vessels capable of striking with sudden ferocity, disembarking warriors anywhere, and vanishing before retribution could be organized. Ideal for swift raids or hasty retreats from trade disputes turned sour, these ships demanded a monumental investment. Dozens of tall oaks, increasingly scarce as land was cleared for farming, iron rivets forged through weeks of relentless blacksmithing, and a sail requiring a full year of textile labour by an entire family. Such endeavours necessitated not just skill, but organisation and leadership, transforming these proto-Viking expeditions from acts of random desperation into coordinated ventures. These efforts were often spearheaded by seasoned mariners and ambitious younger sons of chieftains, men eager to carve their own legacies beyond the constraints of traditional hierarchies. As Thorkel and his apprentices toiled through the bitter winter, similar vessels began to emerge along Scandinavia's windswept coasts and sheltered fjords, heralding the dawn of a new era marked by mobile warfare, opportunistic commerce, and voyages stretching far beyond the familiar waters of home. The earliest proto-Viking forays left behind scant written traces, occurring in an age before literacy took root in Scandinavia, with their targets, often small, scattered settlements, lacking the chroniclers to record their deeds. Yet the silent testimony of archaeology offers compelling glimpses into these shadowy beginnings, particularly eastward across the Baltic Sea. Leif, now 18 and embarking on his second eastern journey, stood poised at the prow of his father's ship, his keen eyes scanning the approaching shoreline as two additional vessels trailed behind, each carrying 30 warriors drawn from their region. They had braved the open waters of the Baltic, navigated the narrow entrance to the Gulf of Finland, and now drew near the territories inhabited by Finnic and Slavic peoples, their languages a foreign cadence to Scandinavian ears. There, Snorri pointed with a steady hand toward a natural harbour half concealed by a dense, wooded promontory, its shadows offering both shelter and secrecy. We'll make camp there and dispatch scouts to probe the settlement ahead. This settlement, later to be known as Staraya Ladoga, emerged as one of the earliest trading posts along the eastern trade routes, its Scandinavian presence well established by the mid-8th century, a testament to the growing reach of these northern seafarers. As their ships grated against the pebbled beach, Leif took charge, directing the younger warriors to establish a defensive perimeter with practiced efficiency. Though their primary mission led toward the exchange of goods, the ever-present possibility of violence hung in the air. Every man was armed to the teeth, the affluent wielding finely crafted swords, the rest carrying sturdy axes and sharpened spears, their round wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses glinting in the weak sunlight. Recall our approach last summer at the Kurland settlement, Snorri instructed, his voice a low rumble of experience. We landed before the first light of dawn, keeping out of sight, moving silently through the forest, rather than exposing ourselves on open ground. When we emerged, we were already within their outer defences. This emphasis on surprise and psychological shock defined early Scandinavian raids, targeting undefended moments, festivals when the community gathered, early mornings when guards were lax, or during foul weather that masked their approach, aiming to conclude their business swiftly and retreat before local forces could muster a response. When forced into direct combat, they deployed flexible formations, utilizing shield walls to deflect incoming projectiles, then breaking and reforming to seize fleeting opportunities or counter emerging threats with lethal precision. Most Unsettling to their foes was not merely their martial prowess, but the psychological warfare they wielded, cultivating a fearsome reputation that sometimes secured victory without a single blade being drawn, a tactic that would reach its zenith in the later Viking era, but found its roots in these nascent ventures. The burial practices of the proto-Vikings offer a profound window into their society, their spiritual beliefs, and the violent world that shaped their existence. The Salme ship burials in Estonia, dating to approximately 750 AD, unveil a particularly chilling chapter of this story. Thorvald the Wise, a grizzled leader with only 12 of his original 40 warriors still standing, stood on the windswept Estonian shore, overseeing the somber task of preparing his fallen comrades for their final rest. The clash with the local tribe had been ferocious, a trading dispute escalating into bloodshed when the chieftain demanded exorbitant tolls for passage, a demand the Scandinavians refused, with steely resolve. "Lay him beside Gunnar," Thorvald directed, his voice steady despite the weight of loss, as men carefully carried another lifeless body toward the smaller of the two ships. They fought as one in life. Let them journey to Valhalla together. The archaeological evidence from Salme reveals a meticulous burial arrangement, dictated by status. Leaders positioned centrally with their most prized weapons and personal possessions laid beside them, while lower-ranking warriors were placed toward the bow and stern, their simpler gear reflecting their station. The wounds uncovered are harrowing. One man's skull bears a perfect square hole punched by an axe, a death blow delivered with ruthless efficiency. Another's hands are nearly severed at the wrists, the defensive scars a testament to his desperate struggle. A third lies decapitated, the vertebrae marked by a clean sword cut from behind, suggesting a swift execution. These injuries, predominantly frontal, indicate prolonged face-to-face combat rather than a cowardly ambush, with multiple wounds on many skeletons pointing to sustained resistance rather than swift slaughter. The presence of defensive marks reveals these were trained fighters who fought to protect themselves, not helpless victims caught unawares. His arm was nearly torn asunder, Life observed, kneeling beside a fallen comrade, yet he struck down 2 more before he fell. Thorvald nodded gravely, his eyes reflecting the cost of their venture. Odin will welcome him with open arms, prepare him with his weapons and gear. The burial goods, swords with intricately patterned blades, spears with ash hafts, axes honed to a razor's edge, round shields with iron reinforcements, gaming pieces for strategic contests like hnefatafel, finely carved combs, practical knives, and small portions of food intended for the afterlife, speak volumes about the investment and status of the deceased, a final tribute to their worth. The sacrifice of 2 ships, valuable assets difficult to replace in a resource-scarce land, underscores the deep religious significance attached to proper burial rites, even performed in enemy territory after a costly defeat. As night fell over the desolate shore, Thorvald supervised the final arrangements, directing his men to drag the ships further inland to a spot less exposed to the tide, mounding earth over them to form low burial mounds that would soon be reclaimed by the encroaching forest. Will anyone remember them? A young warrior asked, his voice trembling with the weight of their loss. Thorvald gazed at the darkening mounds, his expression unreadable. Skalds will weave verses to honour their deeds, kin will raise toasts at sacred blots, and perhaps in time others will unearth these ships. Knowing men from our lands ventured far, fought with valour, and were duly honoured in death. His prophecy held true, though the graves remained hidden for over 1,250 years, until their discovery in 2008, offering a poignant glimpse into this formative era. The eastern trade route, though later overshadowed by the dramatic exploits in Western Europe, marked the earliest significant expansion of Scandinavian influence, forging trade networks that would link Northern Europe to the distant riches of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. Leif, now 24, and leading his first independent expedition as his father Snorri's age confined him to shore, commanded a crew of 30 warriors as they sailed eastward across the Baltic Sea. There, he pointed with authority as they neared the mouth of the river, later known as the Neva, its waters a silver thread cutting through the landscape. We'll follow this waterway to the lake the locals call Ladoga, then press south along the river they name Volkhov. This route, firmly established by the mid-8th century, bore witness to a growing Scandinavian presence, with distinctive Norse artifacts, iron tools, amber beads, and carved combs, appearing with increasing frequency in eastern settlements. The pivotal hub of this eastern enterprise, Staraya Ladoga, founded near Lake Ladoga around 750 AD, had blossomed into a bustling community where Scandinavians, Slavs, Finns, and Balts mingled in a vibrant tapestry of trade and craftsmanship. As Leif's ships navigated the Neva's currents, they encountered their first significant obstacle, rapids that halted their progress, forcing a halt to their journey. "Unload everything," Leif ordered with a decisive nod, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crew. "We'll carry the cargo past the rapids and drag the ships overland where the water calms." This portage technique, enabled by the vessel's relatively light construction and shallow draft, was the linchpin of Scandinavian success in the east, opening vast inland territories to their reach that remained inaccessible to purely maritime powers. After several grueling days of alternating between rowing and hauling their crafts over rough terrain, Leif's expedition reached the settlement at Ladoga. Unlike the cautious, tentative approaches of their earliest ventures, they were now greeted as anticipated visitors, their regular trade fostering a sense of mutual expectation. "Your father is not with you this year," a Slavic merchant called out, his tone friendly as he approached the beached ships. "He sends his greetings to Brina," Leif replied in the pidgin tongue that had evolved to bridge their linguistic divide, a practical blend of Norse and local dialects. Such personal connections were the lifeblood of trade in an era without formal contracts, relying heavily on reputation, trust, and shared customs. The goods exchange in these eastern markets were a rich mosaic. Scandinavians offered iron weapons and tools forged with meticulous care, walrus, ivory harvested from the far north, amber gathered from Baltic shores, honey distilled from their woodlands, and finely crafted items like antler combs, trading for silver coins from Islamic lands, often in the form of dioramas, luxurious furs from the tiger, beeswax for candles, and its increasing number of slaves captured in local skirmishes or raids. The slave trade, though repugnant by modern standards, formed a significant pillar of this early economic activity, with captives transported to distant markets in the Byzantine Empire and Islamic Caliphate, where demand for labour remained insatiable. After spending several weeks trading at Ladoga, Leif prepared to venture further south, following the Volkhov River toward Lake Ilmen and the emerging settlements that would become Novgorod. This southern push represented the next frontier of Scandinavian eastern expansion, driving deeper into the continent, establishing new trading outposts, and eventually linking to the great river systems of the Dnieper and Volga that would open pathways to the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. We've heard tales of new settlements to the south. Leif told his crew, his voice carrying a note of anticipation, places where the Slavs gather furs and honey, nearer to the silver-rich lands of the east. This relentless pursuit of new opportunities defined the eastern ventures, as each established trading post matured, and local populations adapted. Their profit margins naturally eroded, compelling entrepreneurial leaders like Leif to continually seek fresh routes, new partners, and untapped resources. By the late 8th century, just as the first raids began to ripple through Western Europe, Scandinavian traders had carved a presence throughout much of what is now European Russia, connecting the Baltic Sea to the vast river networks of the East, laying the economic foundation for the more extensive networks that would flourish during the Viking Age proper. This Eastern enterprise provided the financial backbone for much of what followed, with the wealth accumulated, particularly the silver flowing from Islamic lands, financing construction of larger ships, the production of advanced weaponry, and the consolidation of power within Scandinavia itself. Without this Eastern trade, the Western raids that would soon terrorize Europe might never have achieved the scale and impact that cemented their historical significance. As Leif's ships pressed southward into territories few of his kin had yet explored, he was part of a transformative economic expansion, one that would eventually weave Northern Europe into the fabric of Central Asia and the Middle East, reshaping the economies and societies of all regions touched by these northern seafarers. The western horizon, while the eastern trade routes were being meticulously established and expanded, began to beckon a select group of visionary Scandinavian leaders with promises of new opportunities. The North Sea and the wild expanses of the Atlantic coast presented distinct prospects and formidable challenges compared to the sheltered Baltic and the navigable Russian rivers. Yet the same blend of trading, raiding, and exploratory zeal characterized these early western ventures. Bjorn Ironclad stood on the jagged, windswept shore of what would later be identified as the Shetland Islands, his keen gaze surveying the rugged terrain that stretched before him. His 3 ships had braved the arduous crossing from the Norwegian coast, navigating the treacherous open ocean rather than the more protected inland waters, a journey that tested both the resilience of their crafts and the endurance of their crews, but proved that regular voyages to these western isles were within their grasp, Fine harbours, he noted to Håkon, his steadfast second in command, his voice carrying over the crash of waves, sheltered enough to defy the fiercest Atlantic gales. And look there, settlements, small farming communities dotted with the Pictish folk, and traces of Celtic influence woven into their ways. These settlements held the dual promise of potential trading partners willing to exchange goods or targets, ripe for plunder should diplomacy fail. Archaeological evidence from the northern and western Isles of Scotland reveals a Scandinavian presence by the mid to late 8th century, with distinctive Norse artifacts, iron brooches, bone combs, and fragments of weaponry appearing in local contexts, suggesting at least intermittent contact through peaceful trade or small-scale raiding. Unlike the eastern routes, where the focus remained predominantly on establishing trading relationships, the western ventures carried a more complex character from their inception. The islands and coastal regions they encountered were often sparsely populated, but governed by local powers with their own maritime traditions, some areas boasting wealthy Christian monasteries. In Ireland, Scotland, and northern England, concentrated repositories of riches, with defences reliant more on prayer than steel. We should approach the main settlement with open hands, Bjorn decided, his tone pragmatic. Display our weapons, but keep them sheathed. Let's see what they offer in trade before we weigh other courses. This measured approach defined many early Western contacts. Violence remained an option, but was not the preferred opening move, with sustainable trade offering long-term benefits, especially in regions the Scandinavians intended to revisit. The Western voyages diverged from Eastern expeditions in several critical aspects. The sailing conditions demanded greater navigational prowess and sturdier vessels to withstand open ocean crossings. The potential trading partners ranged from the Pictish and Celtic communities of the Northern Isles to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England and the fragmented Frankish territories of continental Europe. And most notably, the Western landscape included those wealthy Christian institutions, monasteries and churches, whose isolated locations and spiritual focus made them particularly vulnerable to seaborne assault. As Bjorn's party advanced toward the main settlement, they were met by a delegation of local men, led by a chieftain, his finer clothing and gold torque marking his status, his expression a blend of caution and curiosity. They're wary but not immediately hostile, Håkon observed, noting the subtle tension in the air. They've seen ships like ours before, perhaps traders from Denmark or Frisia drifting off course. Bjorn mused aloud. We may not be the first to venture this way. Indeed, archaeological finds and sparse documentary hints suggest that before the celebrated Lindisfarne raid, there had been a gradual increase in contact between Scandinavians and the British Isles, some likely peaceful exchanges, while others may have involved minor raids or exploratory probes. The encounter with the local chieftain proved fruitful through a combination of gestures and the few shared trading terms that had spread with commerce. Words for iron, wool, and silver. They established a tentative agreement. Bjorn's party offered iron tools, sharpened weapons, and Baltic amber, receiving in return woolen cloaks, leather goods, and valuable information about nearby settlements, including a Christian monastery on a neighbouring island, rumoured to house books bound in gold and silver vessels for their rights. They say the holy men are few and unarmed, Håkon reported after further discussion, his eyes gleaming with possibility. Bjorn considered this carefully. We came to trade, not fight, but we should scout this place of wealth before deciding our next step. The pragmatism of early Scandinavian expansion is often overshadowed by tales of bloodshed. Yet their ability to balance violence with diplomacy, to restrain aggression when profit favoured peace, was a cornerstone of their success. The Western ventures of the mid to late 8th century laid the groundwork for future expeditions, gathering navigational knowledge, harbour locations, current patterns, wind shifts, and political intelligence, wealth distribution, defensive strengths, internal divisions. By the time the monks of Lindisfarne glimpsed dragon-prowed ships on their horizon in June 793, Scandinavians had been probing the British Isles for decades, their reconnaissance paving the way for the systematic exploitation of Western European wealth that would define the Viking Age. The transition from proto-Viking activities to the full flowering of the Viking Age was not a sudden rupture but a gradual escalation, a crescendo built upon the foundations of earlier ventures, culminating in the symbolic raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD. Ragnar stood at the prow of his flagship as it sliced through the waves toward the island monastery, a far cry from Bjorn's exploratory mission years prior. Ragnar led with intent. 6 ships followed his lead, each laden with 40 seasoned warriors, their faces set with purpose. This was no tentative trade expedition with violence as a fallback. This was a deliberate strike on a known target of wealth. Remember, he called to his men as the monastic buildings loomed into view, their stone walls a stark contrast to the sea. The Christian priests do not bear arms, take what shines, gold from their gospels, silver from their reliquaries, seize the young and strong as captives, kill only those who resist. This practical, almost methodical approach to violence underscored many early Viking raids, belying the later myths of berserker rage, with a calculated strategy to maximize gain while minimizing risk. The Lindisfarne raid, immortalized in the anguished words of Alcuin, the Anglo-Saxon scholar, marked the culmination of evolving trends rather than a revolutionary break. Never before has such terror visited Britain as we now suffer from a pagan race, Alcuin wrote, his quill trembling with emotion. The church of St. Cuthbert is stained with the blood of God's priests, stripped of all its sacred ornaments. The horror in such accounts stemmed not just from the bloodshed, but from its sacrilegious context. Attacks on holy ground violated medieval norms, shaking the faith of a devout society. The precision with which the raiders targeted valuable items suggested not random destruction, but deliberate desecration. Archaeological evidence from Lindisfarne and similar sites confirms this selectivity. Precious metalwork vanished, while less portable wealth remained. Bodies of adult males bore combat wounds, while women and children often showed signs of capture rather than death. As Ragnar's men moved through the monastery, They encountered varied responses. Some monks fled to hidden nooks, others knelt in prayer as blades approached, and a few younger brothers fought with staves. "This one swings a staff," Hastein called, deflecting a blow. "He's got spirit." "Take him alive, if possible," Ragnar ordered. Strong men fetch good prices east. Slave-taking, often downplayed, was a lucrative trade, with educated captives prized in Islamic markets. Within hours, the raid concluded, the treasury emptied, select manuscripts taken, dozens of captives bound for the ships. Buildings stood intact, the raiders uninterested in destruction, without profit. "The tide turns," Ragnar noted, eyeing the horizon. "We sail with it." Speed and mobility, their ship's gifts, ensured escape. Lindisfarne's impact, visible and psychological, heralded the Viking Age, built on decades of gradual presence. The rise of warlords as eastern and southern expeditions yielded wealth, reshaped power within Scandinavia, creating a dynamic interplay between external success and internal authority. Bjorn Ironclad stood before the gathered folk at the Thing, the open-air assembly where free men debated and decided, his stature now eclipsing the aging local chieftain. 5 prosperous voyages had amassed a fortune. Silver arm-rings adorned his brawny arms. A pattern-welded sword from Frankish lands hung at his side, and 40 warriors stood behind, their gear a testament to his wealth. "Danish raiders, strike our southern shores," he announced, his voice carrying authority. 3 farmsteads burned last month, 2 fishing boats lost. This ends now. The threat was real, but it offered a chance to consolidate power. "What do you propose?" an elder farmer asked, his wisdom respected despite his frailty. "Unite," Bjorn declared. "Join the 5 surrounding regions. Together we'll build a fleet to guard our coast, and if needed, carry war to Denmark." This vision, merging independent districts under his rule, marked a political leap. Traditionally, chieftains ruled small areas. Bjorn aimed for regional kingship, justified by defence. Archaeological evidence supports this shift. Defensive sites grew elaborate, elite graves concentrated wealth, and central places emerged. To seal this alliance, religious sanction was key. Post-Thing, Bjorn met the Godi. "The people need a divine sign," the Godi advised. A sacrifice for Odin. At the next full moon, representatives from 5 districts gathered in a sacred grove, encircled by ancient trees. Bjorn offered 9 horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs, a lavish tribute. Slaughtered methodically, their blood anointed the crowd. Meat later feasted on, binding the union. "Odin, wise in war, cunning in peace," the Godi intoned. "Bless our pact." Such rites, echoed at sites like Uppsala, legitimized power resisted by some traditionalists but driving Scandinavia toward proto-kingdoms. Christian pressure from Charlemagne's Saxon wars, 772 to 804 AD, shaped Viking emergence. Leif reported to King Sigurd. Franks reached the Elbe, forcing baptism, executing resistors. Sigurd frowned. "How far north?" "To our borders," Leif said. Charlemagne's conquests, destroying pagan sites like Irminsul, threatened Scandinavian ways. "We wait, aid Saxons, or strike elsewhere," Sigurd mused. Choosing west, British Isles, Frankish coasts, avoided direct clash, targeting weak spots. "Send 3 ships north of Pictland," he told Leif. This probe gathered intel, reshaping Europe amid religious strife. The Raven banner rose. By late 8th century, political unity, Christian threat, ship and weapon advances, and target knowledge converged, enabling the Lindisfarne raid, 793 AD. Ragnar oversaw 23 ships, 1,000 men, their raven flag fluttering. Never such a force, Holstein said. Targets, Lindisfarne's gold, then dispersed raids, showed strategy. A beach sacrifice of 9 captives sought Odin's favour. The raid's shock, per the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, marked the age's start. Legacy transformed trade, settlements, politics. Life saw sane ports thrive, Viking genes and words endure. Conversion integrated Scandinavia into Europe. Violence scarred. Alcuin's lament of Lindisfarne's blood fueled fear, spurring defences, forcing Viking adaptation. The saga persists, their versatility shaping Europe, echoed in Salme's bones. Archaeologists at Salme sift sand, linking 1,250 years to proto-Vikings' honoured end. Their story, from need to Europe's reshaping, mirrors human duality resonating today.